Okay, so we have one more part of activity 10-1. So we've worked with the 5-number summary, and we've used the 5-number summary to build ourselves a really nice box plot, very nice box plot. And now we want to use the box plot and the 5-number summary to talk more specifically about outliers, and then to look at something called a modified box plot. Okay, so we know what an outlier is on a qualitative in a qualitative sense, right? An outlier is an observation that's far from typical, okay? But we haven't talked about that in any kind of specific way, like how do you really decide whether you have an outlier or not? And now we're going to have a technical definition, okay? And the technical definition is going to be based on what we consider to be typical, okay? So like when I'm looking at my box plots, maybe among the sparrows that died, all right, here, the box, remember, represents the middle 50% of the data, right? Okay. Now, so that's sort of what we think of as the most typical data, is the stuff that's in that middle 50%. Okay. If something gets too far away from that middle 50%, then we consider it to be an outlier. Okay. And here is where we're going to here is where we're going to talk about what too far away means. Okay, so let me give you the technical definition, and then we can talk about what it means first in terms of the picture, and then we'll do some calculations. It's kind of a complicated definition, all right, or it sounds complicated. All right, so an observation is considered an outlier if it is more than, and here it goes, 1.5 times the interquartile range below Q3 or below QL or above QU. Okay, so an observation is considered an outlier if it's more than 1.5 times the interquartile range below the first quartile or above the third quartile. Okay, so again, that sounds complicated. Let me talk about what it means. Okay, in terms of our picture, and then we'll do a calculation. All right, so looking at the sparrows who died. The interquartile range, okay, is the difference between your upper quartile and your lower quartile. Now remember, the upper quartile is the top of the box, and the lower quartile is the bottom of the box. And so the interquartile range is how wide your box is, right? Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to take that width, and we're going to multiply it by 1.5. So we're going to stretch the box, okay, by a little bit. And then we're going to measure that distance above and that distance below. And if you have an observation that falls outside of the box, the stretch box when it's placed above and the stretch box when it's placed below, that's our measure of what extreme means. And that's what makes us an outlier. Okay? Okay? Because the width of that box, that IQR, is sort of telling us how spread out our data is. All right, so let's try it in an example. Okay, so we'll work with the sparrows that died and then the ones that survived. All right, and now your book goes through the calculation for the sparrows that died, but let's redo that anyways, just so we can be sure we understand what's going on. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is we have to find the IQR of the sparrows that died. Okay. So the IQR is the upper quartile minus the lower quartile. Okay, so that's 163.5 minus 161, or 2.5 millimeters. Okay, so that's our interquartile range. Again, in terms of our picture, That's 2.5 millimeters wide. Okay, and now we're going to stretch it. So we're going to do the IQR times 1.5. So that's 2.5 times 1.5, which is going to give me 3.75. Okay, and then we subtract that from Q1 or QL. I sort of use those interchangeably, right? The lower quartile and the first quartile. So QL minus 3.75, the lower quartile is 161. So I get 157.25. And then I also do QU plus 3.75. So my upper quartile, 163.5 plus 3.75, and that's 166.75. Right? Did I get that right? No, I didn't get that right. 163.5 plus 3.75 is 167.25. Okay, better. Okay, so that's our measure of extreme. If an observation is below 157.25 or 167.25, then it's considered an outlier. Okay, technical definition. Okay, so let's go over to our box plot again. All right, and what we're saying is if an observation is below 157.25, so there's 157.25, roughly, okay, and then here's 167.25 up here, okay. Now you can see here's an observation that's extreme, right? It's outside the bounds. There's no outlier on the upper side, but there's an outlier on the lower side. Any observation lower than 157.25 among the sparrows who died is an outlier. There's a guy, 156. Okay, so he's an outlier. He's the only outlier among the sparrows who died. Okay, that makes sense? All right, and what we're going to do too is we're going to modify our box plot, right, to reflect that there's an outlier, and that's the picture you have in your book. Okay, so we put a little star here for the sparrow who's 156 millimeters, who's an outlier, and then we actually start our whisker in our modified box plot at the first non-outlier observation, right, the 158. There were no observations on the high side, so otherwise the box plot looks the same. Okay? That makes sense? All right. So now let's do it for the sparrows that survived. Okay? And when I look at the sparrows that survived, just looking at the picture of the box plot, I'm telling myself, boy, it sure looks like there's going to be some outliers, because I'm thinking, okay, here's my middle 50%. I'm going to stretch that. Okay, so I'm going to multiply it by 1.5, and then I'm going to move it up. Okay, and it looks like there's going to be an outlier on the high side, and I'm also going to take that stretched box and go below Q1, and it looks like there's going to be some outliers on the low side as well. Okay, so in my head I'm thinking we are going to see some outliers. All right, let's try it. Okay, so my IQR again is my upper quartile minus my lower quartile, so it's 160 minus 158, or 2. Okay, and then if I do 1.5 times my IQR, that's stretching. Okay, so that's going to be 1.5 times 2, that's 3. Okay, that's nice number to work with. And then we'll do our lower quartile minus 3, and we'll do our upper quartile plus 3. So my lower quartile is 158 minus 3 gives me 155. And my upper quartile plus 3 is 160 plus 3, or 163 millimeters. Okay, So outliers on the low side, anything below 155 is an outlier. So look at, 3 outliers. Okay? And on the high side, anything above 163 is an outlier. So there's 2 of those as well. So among the sparrows that survived, we had a whole bunch of outliers. Okay, 3 on the low side and 2 on the high side. Okay, so let's modify our box plot. Okay, so let's see. So my first non-outlier observation on the low side is 155. So I'm going to start there. Okay, and then my lower quartile is 158, 159, and 160. Right, forgot that. My middle 50% hasn't changed. Okay, so there's my box. Okay, and then my whisker goes up to there. I haven't marked my outliers yet. And then my largest non-outlier observation is 163. So that's where I'm going to quit. Okay, and now let's mark our outliers. Okay, so I have a 153 and 2 154s. So I have a 153, put a star there. I'll just put 2 stars here at 154. Okay, and then I had a 165 on the high side and a 166. Okay, and that's my modified box plot. Okay, so that's the plan. All right, last thing. Let's just run through the questions, right? So we did do the outlier check. Okay, and we found our outliers. We did great. Does there appear to be a difference? I think we already talked about that. Certainly there seems to be a difference between the sparrows that survived and the sparrows that died, right? The sparrows that survived certainly tended to be shorter, right? Okay, so Jay, can we conclude that being shorter caused sparrows to be more likely to survive the storm? Careful. Absolutely not, right? Because that's asking us to draw a cause and effect conclusion, and we already said way back at the beginning that this is an observational study, right? And we can't draw a cause and effect conclusion with observational studies. However, notice that K is different. Can we conclude that shorter sparrows were more likely to survive the storm? Absolutely, right? We're not saying that being short caused them to survive, but we do know that the shorter sparrows did tend to survive, okay, at a higher proportion than those who died.